we talked about on a state level, kind of the 50 different flavors is what I'd called it earlier about maybe those different state agencies not playing nicely together in the same sandbox. But we currently see that at the federal level,
Sure.
with U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and U.S. Army Corps of Engineers not aligning on policy and interpretation and implementation of those regulations. And so when you have something like the Endangered Species Act, which at its heart is Section 7 versus Section 10, are you federal or are you private? And the most common trigger of federalizing a project is Clean Water Act that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service does not implement and enforce. Right. It's the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers as the lead federal agency. If those two agencies aren't aligned, you're stuck in a really awkward place as a developer, and we've seen that on projects. And so unfortunately that incentivizes folks to maybe do things at risk that they wouldn't otherwise have done. If the process was predictable and navigable and consistent, they'd be willing to go through it. But instead, because they don't know the price tag and they don't know the timeline associated with it, maybe they're comfortable building something at risk, and ultimately that's not managing the species, that's not accomplishing the goal of the Endangered Species Act. So
that's why it's so important to have good consultants helping you navigate through very challenging situations that maybe even have personal relationships with agencies, to have those really open dialogues on what's the next step. What would you, what do you think would be the best move? I think, developers really do need to pick the consultants that are partners, that have the experience in very local, regional, locations to help them navigate, because it's going to get even harder at this point. We think with deregulation it gets easier.
No, it gets worse.
It gets worse. It absolutely
it's going to get worse before it gets better, I think.
Yeah, people on both sides of the table are unsure how to move forward with something, so things can stall. Ryan, you do have regular meetings, I know, with different agencies. Are you seeing more apprehension and willingness to share guidance on how to move forward, or perhaps on clarity?
Yes and no. Even within the same agency, you start to tease out which offices may be more willing to have an informal phone call and which ones have want to go through a more formal process. And so that's just having those relationships and navigating that space. I think unfortunately from kind of the mid-January layoffs occurring with like U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's hard.
400 staff members were let go mid-January. That removed a lot of those relationships that we had as consultants and that developers had in that space. And so being able to pick up the phone and having an informal conversation for guidance is getting more and more difficult. And so I think that's going to translate to maybe an increased risk tolerance from developers.
You have to. Like I said, do what you did before, document what you did before, and move forward. But you're right. I mean, it's so weird. Everybody wants to think of this government agencies as bloated and they have too many people. I always felt like the Fish and Wildlife Service, the Army Corps of Engineers didn't have enough.
Oh yeah.
They always felt short-staffed. You had one person reviewing 17 permits a month. These permits are extensive. They require thought and process, and I always felt like they needed more. In fact, there was times where we would come in and say, we can help you X, Y, and Z review these because we know you don't have enough resources.
Right.
So now lay off 400 people. Perfect,
Well, it's going to get privatized. So this happened during the first Trump administration, where the federal jobs, which were held by, may I say, merit-based, by and large, people that have had a long history of working in the federal government and understanding these rules and regulations. All of that is now going to probably get sourced out to consultants who we don't have the same history as these people that have spent their life in the federal government and understand all the ins and outs. So what this translates to is more money being spent to make up for the folks that they don't have. Because I'll tell you what, I think I make more money than a federal.
You do,
right?
Sure.
So it's going to cost a lot more money to pay for my time than it would be just to hire somebody at that agency. And the brain trust loss out of the agencies, which is what you're talking about, really is going to translate to more time for permitting. It's going to take more time for approvals. Everything is just going to slow way down because they need to then hire us to come on to help, right? So we're in this kind of very slow cycle of the government then re-ramping up by putting out privatized contracts,
Yep.
which is just going to be more expensive.
Seems a little counterproductive to the goal of unleashing American energy, streamlining the permitting process.
Yes.
Depends on the exemptions. Tomorrow another rule comes out when we're exempting all need for permit, then we'll exempt all need. It's going to be interesting. But I think it's going to be a challenge to track that.
Yeah, I think
Challenge to
didn't
see
he
that.
just put out 300 projects that didn't need permits?
The administration?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yep.
Or he, sorry.
Well, the
Current administration just put out 300.
well,
Yeah.
and there's some wonky looking backwards things that the new administration is doing to try to cite really old laws, really
Yeah,
old
yeah,
things.
yeah.
So for the ESA, I've heard a lot recently about the God Squad, which is this ESA committee that is written into legislation, but it's only triggered during really particular instances and only when I think it's NOAA, because it's the Marine Mammal Act, and the ESA it covers. So NOAA and the Fish and Wildlife Service really deem that a species is going to be highly impacted, but the need for the project is such that it's if it doesn't get passed, then our national security or our progress is going to be impeded. So there's this idea that all of a sudden the God Squad is going to get unleashed and then there's going to be no more ESA. Well, that's not really likely going to happen. But they are pulling out kind of all these stops, or the current administration is pulling out all these stops to say, like, well, we're going to cite an act from 1785, right? Or we're going to, and so there's kind of this weirdness coming out of the woodwork. But again, our clients are smarter than that, and they're going to know, like, we're just going to stay with the status quo to not go back and try to rewrite some of this history.
It may
and try
work
to-
today, but will
Right.
it work next week?
Right.
And I think, so this administration providing guidance to examine, for each agency to examine emergency measures that they might be able to implement right now just to streamline things. Is that what we're referring to a bit? I mean,
Yes.
it does go
all in
along
the
with
same
it
vein.
too. So I am interested to
These
see how that
projects
plays
aren't
out.
short-term projects.
No.
No.
I mean, the projects we're talking about could take 6 years.
Easily.
Just for planning, engineering, all the informations that need to be collected just to make a good decision on where you need to place something. Where it just feels very short-term benefit for something that takes a long term anyway, right?